I'm certainly kind of excited to be doing this. It's the first time I've done a virtual book signing. My family's been bugging me to do book signings because they think I ought to be doing that, and I always thought it was kind of humorous. So this is the closest we're going to get to doing something like that, most likely. And ironically, I can't actually sign your book, so maybe you can hunt me down at one of the HOW conferences or something. I'll be happy to sign it. So we are, in fact, talking about this new book, The Designer's Web Handbook. And before I kind of dive into the content here, I do want to kind of repeat a little bit of what she said about, and I hear lots of beeping. I hope that's not me. About the option here or possibility to, I guess, win some free books and ways to find out about general contests, news, and ongoing sales and stuff. So I do have a little miniature site for this book and my other books, thedesignerswebhandbook.com. So head over there if you would like to keep up on just news about the book in general, future books, and sales and stuff. For example, today there's actually a big sale going on, so if you head over to the site, you can find out where to get the book at a pretty good discount. We're also running a Twitter contest today, so follow me on Twitter, and you can win copies there. And of course, the Facebook page there, you can sign up there, and eventually we'll be doing some promotions there as well. So there'll be a number of ways to get the books for free or for discount, which is always good, I think. And so before I dive into the book, I want to just give you a quick overview of who I am in case you're not familiar. My name is Patrick McNeil. You can find me at pmcneil.com or on Twitter. And I did start my kind of career, I guess, in the IT field. So I started off building networks and servers and phone systems and kind of all the things you do in the IT industry. And eventually I sort of switched over or transitioned to the web community. And as a part of that, I realized I needed to know a lot more about design. And I went back to school for that. And so for about 10 or 12 years, I've been kind of bridging that gap between technology and design. And this has resulted in a bunch of things besides regular work. It's also led me to writing and a lot of the teaching that I do as I try to help essentially designers or less technical people, whichever it is, figure out how to embrace the web and ultimately design for it effectively. So it's kind of where my passion lies, and that's what led me to write this book as well as my other books. So one thing I want to do real quickly is differentiate this new book from my previous one. So a lot of people might be familiar with my idea books, and these are all about presenting tons of ideas, inspiration, covering trends, and all these sorts of things that a designer needs to know about in terms of coming up with fresh ideas. But they're kind of different from the book we're talking about today. And this new book is really more about how do I approach the web as a medium or an outlet for design, but not so much from the idea standpoint, but from the how does it actually work? And so I am essentially looking at how the web works, the different components that go into it, and the things designers need to be aware of, all without ever actually getting into code. So if you don't want yet another coding book or something along those lines, this is probably a good choice because we don't actually go into the coding side of things. It's just more about the mechanics and the things that impact the designer as they approach the web. So I definitely like to think of the web as a medium for creativity and for producing things, much like you would think of painting. And this is one of the analogies I make in the book is to the idea of oil painting. So I want to real quickly read just a little snippet from the introduction of the book because for me this really, draws the best parallel between what I'm trying to do and a medium that many people from the creative world are already fairly familiar with. So I do like to compare the web to oil painting, a topic that many creatives can more easily identify with. So a budding painter simply attempts to control the paint on a paintbrush. Eventually the artist matures and can control things well enough that they start asking some questions, things like, what does the type of canvas I'm using, how does that impact the painting, or how does the primer that I put on the canvas impact the painting? And then into things like considering the various solutions or mediums that we can mix with the oil paints to produce various outcomes. These and countless other questions essentially dive into the technical details of oil painting. These technical issues are limitations the artist works within, regardless of how aware they are of them. And so these limitations will often frustrate the new painter until he begins to understand them and eventually make sense of the limitations he's been working with all along. In the end, it's up to the creativity of the artist to work the medium in unique and beautiful ways, but these fundamental limitations of this medium cannot be escaped. And so painting has these things. And if you think about like the different things you can mix with oil paints and the formulas you can find and stuff, it becomes very scientific and technical in a way, even though the end product is actually rooted in sort of this creative exercise. And so I think it's a real nice analogy to the web, because the web is much the same way. We approach it with a creative mindset, but there are these sort of technical underpinnings that control it. Now, it's probably not a surprise to many people because we all know that the web is technical, but I think that I think it's really a good way to view it, because it can really help guide you in terms of how do I engage this as a way to produce work. And in particular, I like to highlight that the goal here is not to provide a set of restrictions for designers. It's just to help them understand the reality of the medium. It's not about controlling them or squashing their creativity. It really is just about helping them understand what they're working with so that they can then put it to work in the best possible way. So the idea today is to present 5 things that every designer kind of needs to know. In my mind, this really sets these things sort of set a solid foundation for web design. And of course, they parallel the book quite nicely. This very much goes along the line with the content of the book and the kind of the vision of the book, as well as what I want to do today. So hopefully there's enough meat here to where this presentation isn't just a sales pitch for you for the book, but that you can take something away as well. The first thing I really highlight in the book, and that I want to highlight here, is that usability really is king online. It, in my opinion, is one of the most defining aspects of the web. And ultimately, the most important thing you need to realize is that your creations, your web designs, are ultimately going to be actually used. As such, you need to design with this in mind. Your design isn't a static painting, poster, business card, or something else that will ultimately have a fixed sort of format and a predictable presentation or packaging kind of a thing. Instead, the end product will actually be modified, interacted with, shared, and who knows what else. At the end of the day, if a user can't use your design, then it doesn't really matter how pretty or perfect it looks. In fact, at times you'll find that an ugly design can actually outperform a beautiful one, which is something that's quite painful to accept or to believe in a certain way. I also believe that focusing on usability saves clients money and ultimately builds more value into the work that you do. And this really is a common theme throughout my books, and that almost everything I talk about and teach really is trying to inject the most value you can as a designer into your work. And so ultimately, by helping designers figure this out, like how do we put the most value in, I really hope that I can help you maximize your value as an employee or as a freelancer or business owner in the marketplace. And while this book is certainly not about usability, it's most certainly a theme woven throughout. And so, ironically, the usability chapter is actually the shortest one in the whole book, but it's also the first. It sort of introduces the ideas that we'll be working with. One thing I do want to highlight from the area of usability is the notion of conventions, because while we talk about usability, we usually talk about sort of the science of making things usable. And one thing I think that plays a lot into this is just the notion of conventions. And I highlight this because I find that a lot of designers manage to not overlook, but manage to neglect or not understand the power that conventions have. Simple things like putting the logo in the top left, or the main navigation at the top of the page, or only scrolling our page vertically, avoiding horizontal scrolling. And more technical things like using buttons to submit forms instead of a link, for example, because these are the norms people have come to expect. So a real nice illustration of this is if maybe a print designer approaches the web for the first time, they might think it's totally reasonable to put a logo at the bottom center of the page, when in fact, if you've been around the web much, you know that putting the logo at the bottom is actually kind of an awful idea, because then it ends up lost. You don't see it nearly as much because users start at the top naturally. And so these sort of conventions can really play a lot in terms of usability. In fact, when you find a lot of people being like what you would call extra creative or injecting sort of abnormal patterns into the web, when they're most effective is when they kind of stick to the majority of the conventions. They just maybe break or tweak one or two of them. And so in this way, you kind of got some element of predictability or sort of, I don't know, adhering to the norms, but then you're sort of breaking that with this extra element. And so it's one nice way to certainly give something an edge or a unique twist while still maintaining a sense of usability. And so again, more on that kind of in the book, but it's definitely something that's woven throughout all of the content and my messages here and pretty much everywhere I speak. The second thing I want to highlight is the notion of component-based creativity. And it sounds really mechanical, and it's not quite as mechanical as it sounds, I suppose. But the notion that the web is a blank canvas is a bit of a misnomer in reality. If you think about even a blank canvas is not literally a blank canvas in the sense that anything is possible. A blank canvas still has limitations. It's a canvas of a specific size. It expects paint to be applied to it, and so on and so forth. So there's still limitations of what it can do. It's just a matter of kind of understanding those. And one way to understand them is by thinking of them as components or standard elements that we have to work with. For me, this all starts with thinking about the type of site that we're working with. And it might sound a little bit trivial in a way, and a lot of this comes sort of instinctive or automatically. So over time, you won't even really think about it this way. But if we break down, say, a site like an e-commerce site, there's certain components that we expect to have. There's going to have to be a shopping cart. There'll have to be a checkout process. We're going to have product detail pages and so on and so forth. So some of these components are pretty standard, and it's easy to think of them. But in other cases, they're still standard. It's just harder to remember sometimes. For example, on a brochure site, you're still selling something, whether it's a product or service, even though they can't necessarily swipe their credit card and purchase it right there. You're still promoting some product or service, and there's got to be some sort of conversion point where the user can contact the company or do something to become a customer. And so we start thinking about these sort of standard components that we have, and they become the building blocks and sort of elements that we need. If we dig in a little deeper, we find there's also a whole bunch of different sort of modules or combination of individual elements that we can then put into our page. Things like headers and footers and navigation bars and all these sorts of things. And much like I said with the usability and conventions, there's sort of norms with how some of these things should look or normally look. And by breaking one or two of these, we can ultimately create some really sort of interesting and unique results. And again, sites that sort of throw everything out the window and start from scratch and reinvent the entire process can be some of the more painful and difficult ones to use. Whereas ones that simply take the conventions and twist them just a little bit can really be the, I guess, the more boundary-pushing ones that people really look to as kind of interesting examples of modern design. And finally, as you dig in, all sites are ultimately built on the same set of HTML elements. This means they're all using the same containers, the same content tags, forms, images. All of the sort of fundamental elements are the same. They all have the same set of code to work with. And so this becomes the baseline for building sites, and I encourage you to explore these elements and understand kind of the implications each of them have on the process of building and designing websites. So the third sort of point I want to highlight is that production matters. And I say it matters because I think in a lot of situations the designers can get to operate in bubbles, and they simply hand their designs over to development teams that then get produced. In years past, this was particularly true. It's become less and less the case, but every now and then I run into such a situation, and sometimes it's in larger organizations where the designers simply design what they want and the developers then have to figure out how to make it happen. And so what I propose through the book and in general is just that as a designer, it makes good sense for you to figure out how the production process works and how you can be respectful of it and mindful of it as you design. So I want to highlight a few ways that that's possible. The first is just by pointing out the process that a website goes through in order to become a reality. So it starts off as maybe a Photoshop file and gets translated into code. And by doing so, the developer is actually going through the Photoshop file and chopping it up into pieces. So here on the left is a website that I feature in the book, Authentic Jobs. And on the right you can see some of the images that are actually used in the building of this page. And so these are just a few of them, they're not all of them. But these were extracted at some point from the Photoshop document, generated as individual elements, and then reassembled in code as an actual page. This generally is referred to as, I guess, the cuts process, like where you cut up a design into code. And so I encourage you to understand this because as you design and build your files, you have the choice of whether or not you're going to organize your document or not. And the more organized you are, the easier it will be for the developers later on to sort of dig through it and deal with the design you created. So again, in the book you see here some screenshots from that site where the Photoshop file is extremely well organized. It's color-coded and labeled so that the designer or the developer can then isolate elements, chop them up into code real easily, and ultimately replicate the design fairly effectively. Now there are two reasons I sort of highlight this process. One is that it's a great way to be respectful of your developers, to build a good relationship with them, and ultimately to work well with them. The second is that it can actually have a significant impact on the bottom line. And just by being clean and organized, your developers waste less time. There's less revisions later because of simple things they missed because the file was sloppy. But it just increases the efficiency and saves wasted time and money. And finally, there's actually one other point, and that is that it actually can increase the quality of the final output. Since your developer doesn't have to work as hard to figure out what's going on, it's a little easier to translate, less mistakes are introduced, and the end product is just a little bit more polished as a result. Another part of this is that I really recommend you learn some code. And while my book doesn't actually talk about the coding side of things, we do sort of hint at some of the things that the designer has to plan for, like the various HTML elements that you have to design for, or some of the options and possibilities with JavaScript and jQuery and that kind of thing. So I do recommend you learn some code. The more code you learn, the better off you'll be, because then as you design things, you'll understand sort of the implications of your design, like, okay, I understand how this will be coded or how this might be difficult and that sort of thing. But there's also another reason, and that's that the job of web designer, when people are recruiting for such positions, it's become much more common that people expect those people to be able to code their creations as HTML and CSS. Now this code would then be handed off to developers who would integrate it into something like WordPress or whatever system you happen to be working on. But it's become fairly common for web designers to be expected to know how to code HTML and CSS. And I think this is a pattern we'll see increase over time, and it will definitely be more and more of a necessity for designers to at least understand some rudimentary code. Now I will say there's controversy over this. There's some people who are pretty extreme opposite view. They think that designers shouldn't have to learn to code at all, but there's sort of a whole range of different beliefs. I feel like if you learn these things, you will just have more knowledge and be more valuable overall. And this leads really to the idea of pragmatic design. And through this, you really seek to understand choking myself by talking too much today, apparently. Through this, you really seek to understand the implications of your designs. And the more you do this, the more you understand the impact your designs have on the entire process. And of course, say you design something simple, you can understand the impact it has on the costs to implement. So if you know, okay, if I do this one little feature, it's going to cost a whole lot of money to implement. Well, in some cases that might be okay, in some cases that might be bad. Just having that knowledge and the ability to control the outcome is powerful, because then you can match your designs and your projects to fit your client's needs. There's nothing quite as painful as working with a designer that doesn't understand the costs of producing the things they design, because then they really have no control over what they're designing in terms of how much it's going to cost. So if you have a $4,000 website, well, they don't really understand what it even means to design a $4,000 site versus designing a $20,000 or a $50,000 or a $100,000 site. It really becomes difficult to control that when you don't understand the implications of your design. Also leads to a huge impact in terms of the maintenance of your content and ultimately the flexibility of your templates and the designs that you create. So the notion of pragmatic design, I think, is extremely relevant and pretty important to the designer. Number 4, the concept of the web being measurable. In fact, online, pretty much everything is measurable. We can measure, how many page views we get, where people come from, what content they're looking at, what they search for to find us, all these things that we kind of come to know that we can do, but we can track even more than that. We can produce heat maps that show us where on the page someone places their mouse. So we produce a heat map to show us the hot spots of the page, because typically the mouse correlates to the eyes. People point where they look. We can do things like measure how many people scroll down in the page and how far they scroll down. We can measure the effectiveness of banner ads and email campaigns and all of these things to see how many sort of sales or conversions result from those. We can do A/B testing where we deliver the same page in multiple ways and measure which one produces the most results. So the measurability of the web is pretty amazing. And as a designer, if you can wrap your head around that and sort of embrace that, it can really lead to a different type of work that is not only fun, but it's actually quite lucrative. Because it leads us sort of into this repeating cycle where we design something, we implement it, we measure the results, we plan our next steps, and then we repeat the process. And we keep doing this. So rather than sort of showing up, designing something for a client and leaving, never to return, and just let them do what they want with what you produce for them, the idea is simply to design something and build it, but then to measure the results, figure out how we can try to improve this. And it doesn't mean like radical overhauls. It might just mean hundreds of little small steps, like, well, let's try tweaking this and see if more people call us or buy the product or whatever it is. And so really the whole process really becomes much more iterative and much more driven towards maximizing the sales or revenue for your customers. And so not only, again, is it more value driven for your customers, but it's just something that we can do with the web that you can't really do with any other medium. You can't nearly as easily measure or test any other medium that's out there. So my final point here is just the idea of planning for maintenance. When it comes to building a site, you have to assume that the site is going to have to be sort of updated over time. And part of this is changing content. In fact, I've worked on a number of sites where the content changes even before you manage to get the site launched. They start adding sections and removing them, and it can drive you bonkers because you're trying to get a site pushed out the door while the customer's still changing things. So it's certainly an interesting process, but as a designer, you have to assume that your content is going to change over time and that you have to be able to adapt to that and to ultimately be able to accommodate for small amounts of content, large amounts of content, in a variety of different types of individual types of content. For example, maybe you didn't expect people to embed YouTube videos in your page, and somebody suddenly does that, and maybe it works fine, maybe it doesn't. It's just a matter of what you design for and provide the developers with to ultimately build into the templates that you produce. One aspect of this is the notion of content management systems, and that becomes incredibly important because most every site that's built these days is built on some sort of CMS. And each CMS is going to come with it a certain set of restrictions or limitations that sort of put some confines on what you can or cannot do. Now, certainly many of them, like WordPress, seem to be infinitely variable, but there's still some underlying limitations of what's possible and what's not possible. And a lot of that, anything is possible is true, while you have to realize that some things just cost more money. And so understanding the CMS you happen to work with is a really powerful way to have control of your design work and to ultimately to really make the best use of your client's money over the long haul. And so those are the 5 things I kind of wanted to highlight from the book they all pretty clearly correlate to sections in the book, and I think after going through the book and looking at this, I really feel that they go well together. So I don't know if anybody's asked any questions, or if anybody does have any questions. I think Laura will probably pop back in here in a second, and we'll run through any questions you have.
Absolutely. We had a lot of questions actually submitted at registration, so we can go through these. I guess you can speak to this, but you know, we had one of our listeners ask about you know, coding, and is there one coding language you would suggest a designer invest time in learning, or how should a designer approach learning how to code?
Coding starts, no matter if you're doing web work, you have to start with HTML. And so HTML is just how content is marked up online, and the real beauty of it is it's not even a programming language. It's you don't have to learn any sort of programming logic. It's all about understanding the tags and how to mark up content so that it's presentable online. So the HTML would be the place to start. From there, certainly the next step is CSS, and through CSS we apply styles to HTML elements to give them, you know, different sizes and colors and font choices and background images and colors and rounded corners and all these things. So CSS applies the styles to various HTML elements. And then finally, the last piece to that would be JavaScript. And it's actually a programming language, but it would be a distant third. I would most certainly start with HTML, and then that will lead you quite naturally to CSS. And once you sort of master those, you really, it's not too hard to transition then to JavaScript, except that JavaScript is an actual programming language. But the basic idea of JavaScript is that it's a scripting language that modifies HTML and CSS. So once you know HTML and CSS, JavaScript is a really sort of a natural addition to that mix.
We also had a lot of questions about responsive web design. Sure. And whether it's important to learn and whether it's the future of web design.
Yeah. So the idea, just in case not everybody knows what it is, responsive design. It's basically where you have a website that is programmed such that it will style itself to fit various screen sizes. So it looks one way on a desktop, but then through just some different sets of CSS, if you view it on a tablet or a smaller screen, or like a smartphone, it's the same HTML, it just gets styled a little differently using CSS. And it's just to optimize it for that, so you're not pinching and zooming on your iPhone to look at a page, you just simply scroll through it. And I would say yes, that is most certainly a huge factor in terms of looking forward to where the web is going. There will still, I believe, always be a place for mobile-specific websites. For example, if you look at the automotive industry, if you go to like Chevy.com on your phone, you will get a radically different interface. It's a totally different site than you get on the desktop. And I think there will always be a case for situations where you still need a totally separate version. But responsive design definitely addresses the need for the majority of sites to simply present the same content, just in a little more respectful way for the interface that the user is on. And so responsive design is huge, and it does have a huge impact on the work of the designer. In fact, it's if you think about it, if you're designing, you know, say you're designing a regular website and it's got maybe 4 different page layouts, well, if each of those 4 page layouts has to be done at 3 different sizes because of responsive design, you've just tripled the amount of design work and amount of design files you have to produce. So it has a huge impact on the designer in terms of the time consumed, but it's most certainly the way to go. I mean, the industry, honestly, right now is just totally trying to figure out how to adjust practices to accommodate for responsive design. And I do address some responsive design issues in the book. I don't necessarily, you know, I'll tell you how to get around every last aspect of it, but it's certainly a topic that's introduced and covered there as well.
And then when you were talking about measurement, we have several questions about the best tool for measurement. I mean, would you recommend Google Analytics generally, or is there other tool out there that you think is superior?
Google Analytics is like the default standard. Like when in doubt, use Google Analytics. Not only is it incredibly powerful and free, which is totally remarkable, but it gets better and better all the time. They're really adding a lot of features to it. And if you go to almost any business, they're using Google Analytics to track what's going on. So if you're familiar with Google Analytics, you're going to be in a good spot. Now there are other tools that you can add on to it or not add on to it, but other tools that you can use in conjunction with it to do other things. Like there's this one service called, I think it's Optimizely, like spelled kind of weird, but basically lets you real easily do A/B testing, for example. And then there's a number of interesting heat map tools out there. And so those are definitely some, I think one of them is called Crazy Egg, now that I think about it. There's a heat map tool called Crazy Egg. I know. There's a lot of options. But the point is there are a lot of analytics tools. But if you haven't done any of them, just start with Google Analytics. There is so much in Google Analytics that it will get the vast majority of what you need done. And eventually, if you need more, then you can, you'll know more at that point. You'll know what you're looking for. So I would absolutely start with Google Analytics.
And then if somebody is considering, web design versus designing for EPUBs or, designing ebooks, should you basically look at those two those two things as separate? I mean, as separate digital kinds of types of design, or is there some kind of intersection there?
Well, what's interesting is an EPUB file is actually a zip file that contains HTML files. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit. If you change the file extension on an EPUB to .zip, you can unzip it and then look at the actual HTML files that go into it. So yeah, knowing some HTML and CSS will greatly benefit you there. There are, if you talk about designing for the web for computers and tablets and stuff, you have tons of options in terms of what you can do. Whereas if you look at, designing a book for like a Kindle or something, obviously the restrictions are pretty huge, right? I mean, there's sort of certain expectations, and there's not a lot of exploratory, alternate interfaces on Kindle books. You know what I mean? It's just sort of you turn the page, right? So I think there's definitely some restrictions, but it is pretty similar, right? And I think you'll see that intersection actually become more and more blurred over time as the tablets and readers and stuff get more advanced. I don't know about you, but I have a smartphone, ebook reader, a tablet, a laptop, and a desktop computer. It's inevitable that these things start to merge at some point, right?
Yeah.
And so certainly they kind of go together. I think some of it is just a matter of your particular interest. If you are interested in the EPUB stuff, there's a whole market for the people that do that, and I think that that would be a valuable place to go. I've personally not done a whole lot of work there, so I'd be somewhat, ignorant to what's going on there in terms of how to actually do it. So I think there's definitely space for experts in that area as well, if that's something that interests you.
We also had several questions about CMS and different content management systems. If there's one that you think is particularly strong, or what kinds of solutions are good for clients, that kind of thing.
Well, by far the most popular one's WordPress. So it's kind of one of those things, when in doubt, just go look at WordPress. For one, you can set up an account for free and be using it. Two, if you want to download and install it, it's free. And there's just like, you won't be able to imagine something you want to do with it that you can't find a tutorial or plugin or something that somebody's already done with it. So that is absolutely the place to start, in my opinion, because it's so well ingrained in the industry. Now, I mean, there are tons of other smaller, great ones, but for me, that's the place to start. Now, if you want to start selling product, then that's a whole different thing. If you want to do like e-commerce, while there are plugins to make WordPress into an e-commerce site, that's not necessarily always going to work for you. You might want to look at something like Shopify, which is a nice e-commerce solution for small sites, or something like Magento, where it's basically Magento's like the equivalent of WordPress in the e-commerce community. It's free software, and it does a ton of stuff, but it's pretty complicated to figure out. So, and ironically, it's one of the easier ones in terms of the high-end e-commerce sites or products to figure out. So those would be my thoughts. But yeah, start with WordPress. In fact, actually, now that I say that, it's kind of funny. There's actually an appendix in the book that talks about WordPress and introduces it. So that would definitely be my suggested one to start. But it's just an incredible tool. So yeah, WordPress.
And then we had someone ask kind of about web trends or trends in web design. Is there something that you feel is particularly exciting, or do you see anything that's being used or implemented now that you find problematic?
Not so much problematic. What I do think is interesting, and I'm actually writing about this for my next book, believe it or not. There's three things I've seen that come together to make for pretty interesting times to be doing web development. One is lots of advances in online type. So we now have a lot more robust and more effective ways of putting custom typography into web pages. And so we see a kind of a huge surge in interest there in doing not only beautiful things, but just kind of injecting a whole new level of creativity. And then we have the notion of CSS3, which is the newest version of CSS, which introduces rounded corners, gradients, drop shadows, and lots of different visual styles into the CSS. So rather than having to use images to create rounded corners, for example, we can now do that in code. And the reason this is important is because now instead of having to produce a bunch of images for something, we can just code it up, which means when we think about responsive design, and the kind of the last component I want to talk about is we look at the number of devices coming on the market between smartphones and tablets and the variety of devices out there. All of these things have led us really to this responsive design scenario, where responsive design is a great idea because it allows us to adapt the site to fit each different user's interface. And through responsive design techniques, that's sort of media queries and stuff like that for serving up different CSS, we're actually able to deliver the right files. We're using CSS3 to style things, so maybe the rounded corners don't need to be there on the smartphone, but they do need to be there on the desktop. We can easily, through the code, adjust these things, and then of course the typography is really powerful because now instead of having to use JavaScript-based tools or Flash-based tools or any of these funky things for injecting type into a page, it's now just regular type in the page done through CSS. So it's sort of a perfect storm, I think, and that's really the biggest trend and why we see so much of the design that we do right now online. That makes sense?
You were working on, yeah, absolutely. You mentioned you were working on another book. We had somebody ask a question about kind of your next project. What is your new book going to be focused on?
Actually, I have a slide. I didn't intend to show it, but I'll show it anyway. I'm doing number 3 in my idea book series. Wonderful. And each of these books has sort of a, even though they cover trends and themes and stuff like that, I also have sort of a secondary topic, and in the third one it's actually all about technology and how technology has kind of created a lot of the trends that we see currently happening, like these, in fact, these things I've just talked about. That's kind of a simple outline for part of the book, so it's kind of an interesting tie-in. So yeah, but as you can see here, actually I'm taking entries for that, so if anybody wants to go submit their sites, they can send their work in to try to be included in that book, actually.
Awesome.
Yeah, that'll be out February next year, actually. Everybody always asks that. So.
And we had another question about whether the Designer's Web Handbook would be available for sale at the HOW conference in June. We'll have the My Design shop kind of on site there. Do you know if it's going to be available in the store?
I don't, but I would assume so.
I would assume so as well.
If not, we'll bug people until it is.
We'll bug people, that's right. And then I guess maybe at this point, why don't we go ahead and pitch out that the contest question and see if we can get, the right answer for our lucky winner listening today. So.
All right. So yeah, get your typing fingers ready because the answer is very short. So.
And then the answers you can submit in the questions box like you've been using.
Yeah, just post a comment.
Type in your answer there. Yeah.
So what's the first aspect we talked about in terms of what I hope designers would understand and embrace about the web? So while she, hopefully somebody's answering that, if not everybody all at once, I'll mention one other thing while she hunts down the right person. one of the things I wanted to highlight here is just the How Design University stuff that I do, and I actually teach these courses online through How, and they're 4-week classes, and they cover things like just principles of web design. Actually, I'm doing Intro to Coding HTML, Intro to Coding JavaScript, and it was interesting writing and building the courses because they correlate pretty much exactly to the idea of this new book. So, and it wasn't really intended that way, but they actually ultimately really go really well with the book and the ideas that are presented there. So if you like the books and like what's going on there, this might work well for you too. And it's a nice way to, I guess, hear more from me if that's what interests you. So, did you hunt down a winner yet, Laura?
It blew up. We actually had about 50
awesome.
correct answers, so we had a lot of people paying attention. And the first person to respond with the correct answer was Ka Mahina. So we have your email address, and I'll be connecting with you offline to get your address, and we'll ship that copy out this week. And then also, just to go along with Patrick's plug for How You, the courses that he's got coming up actually on Monday. He's got Coding for Designers, JavaScript, and jQuery coming up. And then he also mentioned WordPress. We do have a course starting in a couple of weeks, 28 Days to Your First WordPress Site. That's with a different instructor, but you also might find that useful. And then Patrick's beginner course, Principles of Web Design, is starting June 4th. So there's plenty of different choices and also skill levels. So, you know, you're bound to find kind of the right entry point to kind of start your journey to learning how to design for the web. And then
So
additionally, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, the WordPress course is with Jesse Friedman, right?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, he actually, ironically, he wrote the appendix for this current book, the WordPress appendix. So.
He's like an expert on WordPress, so yeah, it's a great course. And then with any of those courses, if you want to register with Patrick's referral code P McNeil, you can get $40 off the cost of tuition. And then if you didn't win a copy of the book, you can refer to any of the resources that Patrick mentioned earlier. But then also when you get the email with a link to the recording for the session, you'll get a code for 20% off the book in My Design Shop. So keep an eye out for that. And that's kind of it for us. So thanks, everybody, for joining us, and Patrick for kind of taking us through the book. It's a great achievement.
Cool. Well, thanks, everybody, for joining in. I'm glad to have everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The